Snow fell that morning like sifted ash, thin and endless, covering the coffin before the last hymn could fade from the chapel steps. Elias Thornfield stood near the open grave, his hands red and trembling around the handle of his shovel. He had buried countless souls in this valley, yet never had the air felt so heavy, so unwilling to let go. The mourners huddled in black clusters, their breath ghosting in the air. And above all the whispered prayers and rustle of skirts rose a sound that did not belong to the living. The bark of a dog, sharp, unyielding, almost pleading. The animal stood at the edge of the pit, fur dusted with frost, eyes glinting wild gold in the pale sun. Each bark struck through the silence like a cracked bell. No one dared move him. Even Sheriff Calder Nash, who prided himself on order and calm, hesitated with his gloved hand half raised. The dog's name was Rowan, and he belonged to the man in the coffin, or rather, to the man they believed was in the coffin. Maeve Alcott, the widow, stood alone beside a pine tree whose branches stooped under the snow's weight. Her face was unreadable, yet her hands betrayed her. They clutched a scrap of the man's scarf to her chest, as though her heart would unravel without it. She did not cry, not even when Mrs. Lorraine muttered behind her veil. Even the beasts know unrest when they smell it. The dead shouldn't be disturbed so. The whisper slid like smoke through the small crowd. Elias caught it and felt something stir in him, a faint irritation at how grief could so quickly turn to spectacle. When the coffin was finally lowered, the ropes groaned, and Rowan's barks rose to an almost human pitch. Elias wanted to tell them all to stop, to listen. Something about the sound was wrong. It carried no madness, no violence, only insistence, as though the dog knew the world had made a mistake, but he stayed silent. An undertaker was meant to witness, not interfere. When the earth covered the last glint of wood, the crowd began to disperse, the women clutching their shawls, the men murmuring of omens. Maeve lingered until the last hymn note faded into the moan of wind through the trees. Only then did she kneel in the snow, touch the mound, and whisper something Elias could not hear. That night, the valley's quiet returned, except for the barking. It began again after dusk, carried across the frozen hills, reaching Elias's small workshop where lamplight flickered against shelves of polished oak and tin tools. He tried to ignore it at first, to drown the sound in the steady rhythm of his hands sanding a coffin lid. Yet the rhythm faltered. The dog's voice threaded through the cracks in his walls, refusing to be shut out. He poured a glass of whiskey, his third, and stared at the half-finished coffin before him. Its surface gleamed smooth as river stone, but a small flaw, barely visible, caught the edge of the light, a splinter no one else would have seen. He rubbed it gently, as though it were a wound that might open if left alone. It had been months since he'd built a coffin for someone he knew personally, and even now, he could not shake the image of Maeve's stillness, the way her eyes seemed to look past the living into some place far beyond. Elias had once loved a woman who carried the same quiet. Years ago, when the fever swept through the town, she'd been the first to go. The memory rose unbidden. Her last breath, light as candle smoke, her body cold before he could fetch the doctor. He had built her coffin too, hands shaking, tears falling into the sawdust. After that day, his heart had hardened into routine. Death measured, sealed, and buried. But now, Rowan's unrelenting barks reached through that numbness, as if calling him back to something unfinished. A knock sounded on the workshop door. Elias set down his drink. When he opened it, Maeve stood on the threshold, wrapped in a dark shawl, her boots caked in snow. Her face was pale, yet her eyes burned with a strange mix of apology and fear. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly. "He won't stop. I thought maybe you'd know what to do." Behind her, Rowan waited, tail low, chest rising and falling in visible clouds of breath. The sight of the dog made Elias's chest tighten. There was intelligence in its gaze, something ancient and steady. "He'll tire himself soon enough," Elias murmured, though he did not believe it. Maeve shook her head. "He hasn't eaten. Not since the burial. He just sits there, barking, as if—" She hesitated. "As if he's calling him back." Elias met her eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, spun from shared sorrow. Then he nodded toward the hearth. "Come in, at least until the wind dies." She stepped inside, the warmth touching her cheeks with faint color. Rowan settled by the door, silent now but alert, ears twitching at every gust outside. Elias poured her tea instead of whiskey. They sat in a quiet, punctuated by the creak of wood and the distant cry of wolves. "Do you believe," she asked after a long pause, "that sometimes death gets confused? That the soul leaves before it's meant to?" Elias stared into his cup. "I believe the living are often the confused ones," he said. The dead usually know what they're about. Her lips trembled into a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Then why can't he rest? He had no answer. When she left, Rowan followed but stopped at the door, turning once toward Elias with a look that felt almost deliberate, an unspoken plea. Elias closed the door and sat back, unable to work. The barking resumed before dawn, echoing down from the churchyard like a heartbeat in the frozen earth. By morning, the whole town had heard. Mrs. Lorraine said the dog was cursed. The sheriff threatened to put it down. Even the pastor muttered about unholy attachments. Elias watched from his window as Maeve walked through the snow with her head low, the town's whispers following her like smoke. He wanted to go to her, to say something kind. But what right had he? He had already buried her husband once. That evening, when the last shop light in town went out, Elias wrapped himself in his coat and followed the barking through the mist. The graveyard lay still except for the sound. Rowan was there, standing over the mound, paws blackened by soil. Maeve knelt beside him, candle trembling in her hand. "He's been here since morning," she said without looking up. "Won't leave. Won't eat, just—" Her voice broke. "I keep thinking he's waiting for an answer." Elias crouched beside the grave. The snow was disturbed, clawed at, as though something beneath had shifted. His palm pressed to the soil, it felt loose, too soft for the frost's hold. The unease that had haunted him since the funeral tightened in his chest. He remembered how hurried the burial had been, how cold the light, how brief the doctor's inspection. Maeve whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first he thought she meant the wind, but then he caught it. A faint sound beneath the barking, almost inaudible. A hollow thump. He froze. The candle shook in Maeve's hand, spilling wax across the snow. Rowan barked louder, frantic now, as if urging them to listen. "It's just the ground settling," Elias said, though his voice wavered. He wanted it to be true, wanted this to be nothing more than winter's illusion. But the sound came again. A slow, deliberate knock from within the earth. Maeve's eyes widened, and the candle went out. Darkness fell thick and sudden. Only Rowan's furious barking filled the night, echoing against the marble stones, a desperate cry that refused to fade. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He grabbed Maeve's wrist, pulling her back from the grave as the wind picked up, swirling snow into their eyes. Beneath the roar of the storm, beneath the dog's howls, he thought, no, he knew. He heard another sound rising from below, a human breath, faint, struggling, impossibly alive. The lantern at his belt flickered, casting wild light over the gravestones. Rowan stopped barking for a heartbeat and let out a low, trembling whine. Maeve's voice broke the silence, almost a whisper. What if he's still in there? Elias could not answer. His pulse thundered in his ears. The world felt tilted, wrong, suspended between nightmare and mercy. He looked down at the grave, then at Maeve, whose eyes were wide not with fear, but with desperate, fragile hope. The wind carried away the last of the dog's bark, leaving only their breaths in the quiet, steady beat from beneath the frozen ground. In that breathless moment, Elias understood that the burial was not an ending at all. It was a beginning waiting to break through the frost, and whatever truth waited beneath that snow, it would not stay buried for long. Elias had never dug a grave open twice, but that night the ground itself seemed to beg him to. The lantern light trembled in his hand, scattering gold over the gravestones as if the earth were sweating light. Maeve knelt beside the mound, her palms pressed to the soil as though prayer alone might part it. Rowan paced in restless circles, his breath pluming into the frozen dark, every exhale sharp as glass. The town was sleeping, but the graveyard pulsed with a quiet dread, the kind that crawls beneath the ribs and refuses to leave. When Elias sank the shovel into the earth, the sound was raw, metallic, and final. Maeve flinched at the first strike, yet she did not stop him. They worked in silence, he digging, she holding the lantern, its flame flickering against her face like a heartbeat trapped in glass. Snowflakes melted as they fell onto the disturbed soil, leaving dark freckles of thaw. Rowan stood at the edge, issuing a low growl each time the metal hit something solid. The night smelled of rust and pine and fear. Hours passed as the grave slowly surrendered. Maeve's hands were blistered and shaking, her breath coming in soft gasps, but she refused to leave. Each shovelful brought with it a memory. The way her husband used to hum when he worked the fields, the sound of his boots on the porch. She had buried those sounds with him, or thought she had. Now, every heartbeat whispered betrayal. When Elias's shovel struck wood, he froze. The noise rang hollow, echoing deeper than it should have. He brushed the dirt away with numb fingers until the coffin's lid revealed itself, slick with frost. The world narrowed to that single wooden boundary between life and truth. Maeve's candle wavered, dripping wax like tears onto the snow. "Wait," Elias breathed. "If we're wrong—" "We're not." Her voice was a thread of conviction. "Open it." He hesitated, but the dog's growl turned into a sharp bark, a sound that felt like command. The latch gave with a groan. When he lifted the lid, the light fell across emptiness. No body, only the folded linen shroud, unmarked, untouched, and the faintest indentation where a man's weight once lay. The silence that followed felt heavier than any scream. Maeve staggered backward, hand over her mouth. Elias stared into the hollow space, his heart pounding like thunder trapped in his throat. The air inside the coffin was warmer than it should have been, carrying the faint scent of pine and something else. Something alive. "He's gone," she whispered. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, as if startled by the truth. From somewhere beyond the trees came the faint, mournful cry of a coyote, though Elias knew it was not a predator that the dog heard. Rowan lifted his head toward the woods and barked once, twice, then turned and bolted into the darkness. Elias met Maeve's eyes, saw there not terror but a fragile, radiant hope. Without speaking, they followed. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches glistened like spears of ice, moonlight breaking through in fractured veins. The trail wound through the pines, their shadows long and trembling. Elias's breath came ragged, his fingers numb on the lantern handle. Maeve moved like someone half dreaming, led by faith older than fear. Ahead of them, the dog's barks grew softer, rhythmic, guiding, not frantic now. The air changed. Beneath the snow's scent came another, smoke. Elias slowed, raising the lantern. A thin line of it twisted upward from behind a cluster of fallen birch. They stepped around, and there, nestled in the hollow, stood an old hunting cabin. The roof sagged, the door hung crooked, but a faint orange glow burned within. Rowan sat outside the entrance, tail thumping weakly against the snow. Maeve's voice cracked. "Noah?" Elias pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the must of damp wood and faint heat from a dying fire. A figure slumped beside the hearth, wrapped in blankets, hair matted, skin ghostly pale. For one terrible instant, Elias thought it was a corpse. But then, a movement, a shallow, trembling breath. Maeve fell to her knees, the lantern clattering beside her. "Noah!" she sobbed, shaking his shoulder. His eyelids fluttered, blue veins visible beneath paper skin. The sound that escaped him was more sigh than speech, but his lips formed her name. Rowan crept close and pressed his muzzle to the man's chest, whining softly. Elias turned away, overcome by a sudden weakness. He leaned against the doorway, eyes stinging. He had buried men for 20 years, but never had he seen one return. The world for a heartbeat felt like a door left ajar between realms. Hours blurred. They fed Noah sips of water, wrapped him in coats, built the fire higher. He spoke little, his voice broken, words scattered like leaves in wind. He remembered the cold river, the fall through the ice, the suffocating dark. And then, waking in a wooden box, air thin, heart barely beating. He had pounded once, twice, before the light dimmed again. Everything after that was silence, until Rowan's paws scraped above him, calling life back to him. Somehow, he had crawled free through loose earth and wandered until the cabin found him. When dawn broke, it painted the snow in pale rose and gold. The three of them stepped outside, Noah leaning against Maeve, Rowan padding beside them with slow dignity. Elias watched them, a strange ache blooming behind his ribs. He realized then that redemption had come not through prayer or duty, but through the unrelenting faith of a creature that refused to accept death's finality. They reached the edge of town as the first bells rang. Doors opened, faces appeared. The townsfolk froze at the sight. Maeve's husband, the man they had mourned, walking unsteadily through the snow, eyes hollow but alive. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through reeds. Mrs. Lorraine crossed herself. The sheriff, hat in hand, could only mutter, "By God." Elias met his gaze. "Not by God," he said quietly. "By loyalty." The words settled like a blessing and a challenge both. Maeve turned toward him then, her expression softening. A silent thank you passed between them. He nodded once and stepped back, letting her lead her husband home. Later that evening, Elias found himself at his workshop window, watching the snow drift past the glass. He could still hear the faint sounds of joy from the Alcott cottage. A crackling fire, laughter tentative as spring after too long a winter. Yet beneath that joy lay a quieter music, the steady, rhythmic bark of Rowan as he circled the yard, guarding what his heart had restored. In the following days, the town softened. Where there had been whispers, there were offerings, bread, firewood, cautious smiles. The sheriff stopped by to apologize, his hat twisting in his hands. Even Mrs. Lorraine left a ribbon on Rowan's resting place after he passed. Days later, quietly and without pain, Maeve buried him beside the grave that had once been her husband's. She placed no stone, only a simple carving Elias made, a small wooden dog, head lifted toward the sky. The snow fell thick that night, muffling every sound except the slow crackle of firewood. Maeve sat by the hearth, Noah's hand resting over hers, their silence full of gratitude. Outside, the wind howled but brought no sorrow, only memory, only peace. Elias visited once more before the thaw. The valley shimmered with the promise of early spring, yet snow lingered where the graves lay. He stood before Rowan's mound, his breath visible, his hat in his hands. The stillness around him was the kind that hums with unseen life. "You were right," he murmured, his voice rough with warmth. "Sometimes the living forget to listen." He left the carved marker in place and turned toward the path home. Halfway down the hill, he stopped, feeling as though the air itself had shifted. A single bark echoed behind him, soft, distant, impossible. He smiled without looking back. That night, the undertaker's dreams were quiet for the first time in years. No cries, no coffins, only snow, a dog running through it, and a woman's laughter carried on the wind. In the years that followed, the story became a kind of prayer among the townsfolk. They spoke of the dog who defied death, the undertaker who listened, the woman whose faith thawed the coldest ground. Each winter, when the first snow fell, someone would leave a lantern burning by Rowan's grave, and the valley seemed warmer for it. Elias grew old, his hands stiff with memory, but each winter he returned to that same hill. Sometimes Maeve would join him, their silence companionable, like two ghosts watching over a miracle they once witnessed. The world had moved on, yet the graveyard still held its secret peace, a place where life had dared to rise from its own burial. When he finally spoke again, his words were carried softly by the wind. "It wasn't a miracle," he said, as though to the dog, to the sky, to whoever might still be listening. "It was love refusing to be buried. And if anyone had stood close enough that night, they might have sworn they heard a faint bark in answer, somewhere between the trees. Somewhere the snow never settled for long." So ends the whispered tale of the barking dog and the coffin that could not hold its dead. A story of faith born in fur and frost, of love that trembled but did not die. Remember it when the nights feel long and the world cold around you, for sometimes the smallest voice is the one that saves us. If this story touched your heart, stay a while, and subscribe for more whispered tales, where every silence hides a heartbeat waiting to be heard.